Okay, so good afternoon everyone and welcome to today's event, Look Back, Think Forward, Reshaping the Nordic Avant-Garde. My name's Marianne Mulvey and I'm Curator of Public Programmes here at Tate Modern. So this two-part series, Nordic Art and its Discontents, which this afternoon is part of, is supported by the Nordic Culture Fund. And this series has come about through initial discussions with the Nordic Council and some research trips which have been generously supported by the Nordic embassies. And these have led to some really fascinating conversations with many artists and curators working in the region. A continued conversation with our chair, Jonas Ekeberg, who's a curator and critic based in Oslo, and the editor of Kunstkritik, have really solidified the thematics of each panel. And our aim is really to share a set of practices at Tate Modern that are not currently the focus of other parts of our exhibitions and collections programme. And I'd also like to say that through these research trips to Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland and Finland most recently, myself and my colleague Emily Stone, who you probably met at the door, have encountered many more artists than we can present in these two panels. And we're really looking forward to bringing them into dialogue with UK artists in future programmes at Tate Modern. So please do watch this space. So the first discussion that we held in November interrogated the Nordic model of welfare state funding and what this means for art production and how this is changing. Now this second discussion considers artistic and curatorial projects around looking back and unearthing, reworking or collaborating with historic avant-garde art practices in the Nordic countries. Today's presentations from artists and curators Henrik Andersson, Cecilia Grönberg, Joasia Krysa and Eline Mugaas will bring to light, we hope, art practices that can challenge the Western canon of avant-garde, feminist and situationist art histories as they give their own accounts of looking back to rethink the contemporary moment in all its complexity. So one question we might ask is how can reimagining past practices make a meaningful impact on the shifting socio-political dynamics of contemporary Northern Europe? And we're also really keen to inflect this discussion in the context of the UK. So we might ask where similar practices of revisiting and revising are happening and to what effect. So in light of that question, I'll just make mention of a couple of Tate examples that are pertinent to today's discussion. So currently at Tate Britain, the exhibition Conceptual Art in Britain, 1964 to 79, explores a pivotal period in British history, where artists began to abandon traditional approaches and made ideas the essence of their work. Up at Tate Liverpool, the exhibition Art Turning Left, How Values Changed Making, 1789 to 2013, with a really much broader historical scope, examined how the production and reception of art has been influenced by left-wing values. This exhibition included a display of archival material from the Danish artist Palle Nielsen's social experiment, The Model, a model for qualitative society, 1968. And this was a utopian project that attempted to create a new form of social interaction by transforming Stockholm's Moderna Museet into a free adventure playground for children. So it's these kind of practices, curatorial, artistic, that are under discussion today. And after the presentations, we have around 45 minutes for discussion, and it'd be really great to hear from you guys. So any comments, questions you have, please do throw them at us. And if you can help us kind of further connect the discussion to a UK context, we'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to hand over to Jonas in just a second. He'll further set the scene for us and he'll introduce our panel as we go. And your programmes, just to say that your programmes offer full biographies of everyone. During the discussion, we've got roving mics. Please raise your hand if you've got a comment or a question, because we are recording this event. Okay, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Welcome all. And thanks to Tate Modern for hosting this series on Nordic art called Nordic Art and its Discontents. like Marianne said, in the first panel in November, we discussed the, let's say, privileged position of Nordic contemporary art in the context of the current social, economic, and political European climate. Today we will be looking back, not to the great Nordic golden age of the turn of the last century, nor to the Nordic modern masters, but to the Nordic avant-garde of the post-war era. It is perhaps not an art that is very widely known internationally, but all the more interesting to discover, as I'm sure that you will learn today. Actually, the question of locality has become increasingly central to the discussion on global avant-gardes during the last 20 years. How come? Well, defining the avant-garde, finding the avant-garde, locating the avant-garde is where used to be quite simple, and it all happened within the context of the Western art world and the Western political climate. Avant-garde work had to tick at best 3 of the following boxes, at least 2. It should be radical in form. It should be institutionally radical, it should challenge the context of art, and it should be radical in terms of politics. But as I said, this all was based on a Western viewpoint. And then you have the legacy of the discussion on this, on the avant-garde, the academic, more or less, discussion on the avant-garde. And we all know the German literary critic Peter Burger's statement of 1974. Or let's say his viewpoint is kind of limiting. It says more or less that the original avant-garde of the pre-Second World War era was the only one that had the political hope. The avant-garde of the 60s and 70s was not worthy of the name because it was not really challenging the status quo. It was already absorbed into the art institution. Now, 20 years later, the US art historian Hal Foster rather efficiently made the counter-argument that the repeated strategies of the avant-garde of the 60s and 70s was never only repetitions. It was, according to Foster, actually in the repeated instance of the radical gesture that its intention was actually realized. It's a very intelligent way of positioning US avant-garde of the 60s, of putting them back into the heart of art history. However, still Western-centric, and even more than before, US-centric. And today, another 20 years later, it seems like there is another layer added to this discussion as a global view on the avant-garde or avant-gardes is gaining in importance and centrality. When this happens, the Euro and US-centric view of the avant-garde is widened by a multiplicity of art histories and avant-garde impulses, each relating to its own geography and chronology. So modernism doesn't happen only in one place, and certainly not only at one point in time. The Dutch scholar Hubert van den Berg has called this a rhizomatic model of the avant-garde. It can arise in many places under different conditions, etc. This way of thinking about the avant-garde is practiced in the major Nordic academic effort called A Cultural History of the Avant-Garde in the Nordic Countries, year 1900 to 2000. It's going to be 4 volumes. Each is like 700 or 800 pages. There's one out this spring. I think this last 2 is coming in the coming 12 months or so. But one can certainly ask why this hasn't happened before. And perhaps the Nordic scholars has in a certain way been blinded by the dominant US narrative, both in terms of its major figures and in terms of method. There are many examples of this, of course. Today, rather than looking for great artists that can fit into the US-centric picture, scholars are looking for avant-garde impulses, Nordic networks, forgotten artists and projects, even minor ones, who, understood in their own context, become important contributors also on an international scale. And importantly, for today's panel, I think these academics are joined by artists, curators, and editors doing some of the same work from very different vantage points. And one of the questions we can discuss is whether or not the work you do as practitioners, let's say, more than scholars, has a different impact or has a different meaning than the work scholars do. There are many questions, interesting questions raising from this development. One of them being the position of regionalism and, let's say, the avant-garde in the periphery or semi-periphery of the art world. How is this imagined now in this historicizing instant? And I hope that there are some people here today who know British art history. I think British artists outside of London has experienced some of the same limitations, missed opportunities, and invisibility as many artists in the Nordic countries has. But let's also notice also the same condition of potentiality. Because as we know now from these avant-garde histories, there is always creativity and politics involved in reception, interpretation, and repetition. So, to get to today's topic, this is perhaps some of the same creativity and potential that the four artists and curators we are presenting today are experiencing as they are looking back at the Nordic avant-garde of the 60s and 70s, and using this, crucially, as the central element in their work today and in their own work today. They are in the receiving end, let's say, of these historical events, but they use it to new ends. And there is a potential in that, of course, as we will learn. So if there is one central question in today's discussions, I would say that it is, how is the work of the avant-garde an operative ingredient in your work today? So if you can all answer that, just simply and efficiently, we'll be home soon. No. This is an important topic of contemporary Nordic art, and it's been more or less everywhere during the last 5 to 10 years. And some of the starting points for these discussions has been feminist issues, situationist politics has been very central, new technology, and new media. And most of these issues are represented here today. And the Danish artist Asger Jorn and the situationist has been especially central to the reworking of the avant-garde in Denmark and Sweden. And in a few moments, Henrik Andersson will take us on a trip in Asger Jorn's footsteps on the Swedish island of Gotland. I hope that's what you're going to do, yes. After Henrik, Cecilia Grönberg will direct our attention to a range of issues exploring alternative and experimental languages, sites, and concepts, part of her work as image editor at the extremely important Stockholm-based journal OEI. And following Grönberg, Joasia Krysa will tell the story of the exhibition Aarhus Report, Avant-Garde as Network, parenthesis, or the politics of the ultra-local, set in the Danish city of Aarhus a couple of years back. And I guess at this I will suggest that it's an exemplary project in terms of exploring local narratives and local starting points rather than always referring to the international canonized avant-garde. And finally, we will follow Eline Mugaas in her effort to rediscover the work of the Norwegian sculptor Siri Aurdal, an artist that left the art world in 1980 and who has been largely forgotten until now. So we are looking forward to this. I am looking forward to this very much. As I said, I hope that there will be this space in the end that we can discuss, all of us, both these Nordic issues, but also perhaps widening it up to a larger European situation or even UK situation. So with this, I'll turn to our first panelist, Henrik Andersson, an artist based in Stockholm now, but has been working out of Gothenburg for many years also. Used to be a curator at the Konsthalle Röda Sten, Red Stone, in Stockholm, and also a teacher at the School of Photography there. And he will take us to Gotland now. So, Henrik.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for coming. And I was told we are on a tight schedule, so let's get started. I will talk about this research project that I've conducted on the Scandinavian Institute of Comparative Vandalism in its archive. And this institute was founded by Asger Jorn. For those who don't know him, he's a very famous abstract painter from Denmark, and founder of such movements as the Cobra Group in the 40s and 50s, and Bauhaus Imaginist, and later on the situationist movement. And it's the situationist movement that has some relevance to what we're about to see here. So I will just tell you a little bit about how I came across the situationist movement. I was in art school in mid-90s, and in art school in mid-90s, Sweden meant a sort of postmodern hegemony, so we could have lecturers coming in saying there's no one believing in ideology anymore, there's no one believing in revolution anymore. And it was, those words doesn't make a lot of fun to an art student. And then the situationist movement came back into sort of circulation, 97 or something, sort of rediscovered. And these guys seem to be having a lot of fun. They have sort of calculated with all these topics like capital's repressive tolerance, they've subjectivity through media logic, and they seem to come up with oppositional concepts for this, and they seem to be having a lot of fun. And then we learned, me and my friends, that there was a Scandinavian branch of these guys, and we went to lectures with them. They were already old at this time in '97, but we went to lectures with Hardy Street and others. So they were kind of important to me and some others. And then I, moving a bit forward, a couple of years back I moved to the island of, and I lived in the island of Gotland, which is a remote island in the Baltic Sea. And there I learned the story that Asger Jorn was buried there. And I didn't know it before, so I kind of, okay, if you know the situationist movement, you know that this has a meaning, this means something. So I looked into this story and I've kind of followed it up. And it turns out that he has been working extensively with trying to formulate a Scandinavian art history of his own. It's a project that can be seen in many different ways, both as a political project, both as an artistic project, both as a project purely art history, and these things come at the same time. So it's difficult to interpret. But one important step on this, Asger Jorn had used a lot of his money and famous success to employ photographers to go around Europe, Scandinavia, and to photograph predominantly medieval art, but also other things. And when the split in the situationist movement in '62 came, where the sort of Scandinavian branch, they were excluded from the Paris branch. The Scandinavians, they launched sort of a magazine or a situationist international of their own. And they launched a magazine called Drakabygget, against atomic bombs and popes and politicians. And this is the first opening of this magazine. And in this, they sort of, and this is very much Asger Jorn, he probably paid for all of it and probably wrote most of it, but in this, they come with some statement and remark sounding a bit like strategic essentialism of Scandinavia or something like this, opposing what would later become the EU, UNESCO, almost everything. They call upon meetings and stuff like this. in a very situationist way. You have to remember that they also, and I'm quoting this, in terms of theory and practice, they say, we intend to launch our theories after the event. So when you read something they write, it's actually the event itself. It's probably not theorized in the same sense that we can think it. Well, so after this split, Asger Jorn focuses on this project, the Scandinavian Institute of Comparative Vandalism. And what the aim is to create a volume of 32 books, art history books, on Scandinavian history, that was to be predominantly only photographs, with sort of his own composing these photographs, comparing them, and so on. And initially had a lot of support from archaeologists and from famous scholars. And it is with this intention in mind he comes to this island of Gotland in 1964. I have some friends with him. Jacqueline de Jong is there, and Gerd Franceschi, the photographer. And they spend a summer there documenting the whole island. So this is what I've been focusing on, going back in this archive, focusing only on this because it's so vast. It's about 30,000 photographs. So, and looking at, trying to understand his scope, trying to understand this type of optics that he uses, and yeah, trying to understand this artistic failure, if you might say, because the books never happened. The scholars eventually just pulled the plug on him. So we'll go to... Okay. So this is what the archive looks like. It consists of these contact sheets from photographs taken with the Hasselblad camera. You have 12 exposures on every roll of film. My work was to try to follow up on how he worked, sort of coming to a church. What do they see? How do they try to compare, and what are they up to? So in this case, you would see actually footage of themselves working, documenting. You would see all these sculptures of faces and a gargoyle, and this is me making an enlargement of this gargoyle-like sculpture. You could say that he is an amateur. He is in terms of doing out of love, or conducting this research out of love or passion. And if you look at it sort of on a quick way, you would see that he's trying to view Scandinavian history in the same way as Europeans in the 19th century viewed classical Greece, the classical Greek period. So this is actually a type of course, idiosyncratic way of thinking, to create sort of history out of your own mind. But it's also viewing something from your own horizon, not trying to use others' horizon, but using the horizon that you sort of self can grasp. So moving on. So what we did was actually I invited we made an exhibitions with these photographs in Gotland, and then inviting people to come along and to make like a road trip in Gotland. And we also invited Jacqueline de Jong, who was with Asger Jorn in 1964. So it was very good, and we could revisit sites and see how things have changed. And for instance, this tower, you can see that have been rebuilt. And this is a monolith stone. Oh, sorry. The images is not so good here, but so what he's doing what separates him from like an archaeologist or someone at the time is that he uses André Malraux, the famous art critic who wrote Museum Imaginaire. In English is a better title actually. The Museum Without Walls. Yeah, Museum Without Walls. Using photography as a way of making things and objects, I guess, coexist at the same time. Making enlargement, comparing structures, comparing figurations. So when Asger Jorn moves into a church, you could, on the left-hand side, see a medieval image, a relief of an animal, perhaps a horse. But on the same church, in the foundation, he sees something else. There is this type of circular shapes, and it's actually a stone that was not the markings were made 1,000 years earlier, before the church was made. So this stone had been moved to this place as a building material, but still the kind of old pagan so that is incorporated. And this is one of the important Asger Jorn thesis, that there exists a type of, he calls it vandalism, that it is a type of Scandinavian way of just remodeling and reshaping and overwrite structures and symbols and so on. 2 minutes, yeah. I think we move a little bit forward. Again, he also takes a great interest in graffiti made on the plaster walls. Very unclear when these are made. They could be made like in, they could be hundreds of years old, but they could also be 50 years old. So these are equally interesting to him. And this that looks like a cross here is actually a labyrinth, and this labyrinth can also be found outside. And in this case, it's a labyrinth called Trojaborg. They are actually probably from the Stone Age or Bronze Age. And this is also how he views and sees the art history. I will try to make a final remark about what he's trying to do. So what is the opposition? What is the enemy to Asger Jorn here, actually? And I would say he's trying to overcome this idea of contemporariness. Because contemporary means that you would have objects that exist on different ways in the world. So you would have one object that relates to a contemporary context, and then an object right next to it relating to some other time or so. In Asger Jorn's sort of image world, he tries to make them all coexist at the same time. And to me, you asked me about sort of the avant-garde, or this is an interesting thought, because if contemporary also translates into cultures or ethnicities, we have a problem. If some cultures are not contemporary and other cultures or ethnicities are, this is a problem to us. Which conflicts are they today made, I think. The time's up?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And yes, I hope we get time to discuss these issues a little bit more. But let's turn to Cecilia. She's a photographer and researcher, and in the final stages, I think, right now, this summer, of finishing her PhD, distributive photography. But since 2004, she has, together with Jonas Andersson, who is also here today, been one of the two central editors of the OEI magazine, an artistic and literary publishing project devoted to, and I quote, extradisciplinary spaces, de-disciplinizing moments, experimental forms of thinking, montages between poetry, art, philosophy, film, and documents, editorial enunciations, aesthetic technologies, non-affirmative writing, speculative geologies, and alternative historiographies. We can't wait.
Thank you for this invitation. Well, OEI magazine was founded in 1999 and has published 72 issues. The publishing structure, OEI Editor, was initiated in 2002 and has issued around 80 books on poetry, art, aesthetic documents, theoretical and pedagogical texts, etc. And an important part of OEI's activities has always been to organize different forms of readings, seminars, screenings, presentations, exhibitions, or unfoldings of books and magazines. As Jonas mentioned, Jonas Ekeberg is one of the founders, as well as the editor-in-chief of OEI, and I'm the image editor. And we run this project as a literary and artistic project. So we have been active both as authors, editors, translators, publishers, curators, critics, and researchers. Or what we have been trying to do in our work is to investigate all these positions in the context of a larger publishing adventure. One of the book projects that we are currently working on is Skaraborgs Museum. It's an ongoing project. We started research the material for already 15 years ago. And it is about stratification in reading, writing, visualizing, bookmaking, publishing, and distribution. And a key concept is the expanded book, the stratified book that would be at the same time more localized than material and more knowledgeable about the distributed character of books today. It's not only taking the production and the apparatus of the book itself into consideration, but also the dissemination of it, the ways in which it can create or meet with readers, etc. All our books, as well as issues of OEI magazine, are often outcomes of long-term researches in different archives, libraries, and collections. And an OEI issue is always a visual and verbal montage between different fields, documents, and temporalities. And they are often also investigating forms of alternative historiography. And this is not primarily a work of complementary additions of writing in what has been written out of official history, even though bringing together and presenting new information is one important aspect. It is alternative historiography in the way of alternative ways of writing history, which for us have entailed a montage-based stratified practice, also allowing for more material, visual, and spatial forms of historiography. In 2011, we published a 392-page issue of OEI magazine devoted to Swedish conceptual art, OEI 52, edited by Franz Josef Petersson. And Swedish conceptual art was never a coherent phenomenon, but existed as different practices that were not necessarily in contact with each other at the time. And Swedish conceptual art was never included in any historical survey or part of any large-scale exhibition, nor at the time, neither during the following decades, which resulted in a kind of amnesia. In the 90s, there was even a notion that there had never been any Swedish conceptual art at all, despite artists and groups such as Jo Malander, Mats B., Nils-Olof Bonnier, Björn Ligan, Carl Fredrik Reuterswärd, Leif Eriksson, Karl-Erik Ström, Susanne Högberg, Bertil Laurin, and many of them are still practicing artists today. The issue has two different and temporarily separate tracks. One consists of a dozen new essays on the work of artists and writers, and the other consists of a quite extensive reprint of books, magazines, works, catalogues, ephemera, statements, documentations of works, and exhibitions that, taken together, give the reader access not only to the work by different artists, but also to a discourse on conceptual art that was produced at the time. And the variety of different sources, or by different production technologies, from newsprint to Xerox, high-res offset to handwriting, forced us to reflect a lot on the question of reproduction, since we wanted to keep the documents also as active, readable works. So this is that issue. OEI 63-64, Strata geologisk tid, jordkonst, land art i Sverige, was edited by Jonas Ekeberg and myself from 2014, and it sketches out a possible history of earth art, land art in Sweden. Its 624 pages are conceived as an exhibition, installing series of works in the pages of the magazine, interspersed by a long montage essay on earth as medium. There was never any earth art movement in Sweden, but nevertheless there were many artists making earthworks. So this OEI issue on strata and land art was not driven by a desire to formalize different practices into a movement post factum, but rather to create possible connections between different practices that share sensibilities, orientations, method, subjects, matters, etc. And to the top left of the slide, you see Bengt af Klintberg's isutställning, the ice exhibition from 1965, the Fluxus performance, or a temporary exhibition happening on one particular day, the vernal equinox. To the left, you see Gert Aspelin's landskapspartitur, landscape script, an artistic excavation of a sand ravine in Kivik in southern Sweden that's been occupying Aspelin since the 70s until today. You have Veine Johansson's schematic Xerox drawings of trees as biosystems from the 70s. It's visible to the bottom left. While to the right you have Gunilla Wihlborg's landskapsbroderi, landscape embroidery from the early 90s. And it's a piece that she realized in collaboration with the farmer Henrik Andersson, as well as 2.2 acres of oat and 2.06 acres of barley on farmland south of Stockholm. And these four examples are from different decades and artistic contexts, but they allow for transversal readings of landscape processes and visualization strategies, national processes employed in the production of the work of art, etc. And when editing the material, the visual material for this issue, I extended some of the ideas on visual montages that Jonas Ekeberg and I developed for a book and an exhibition on the Swedish collage and typewriter poet Bernt Pettersson. It's called För påseende, Bernt Petterssons collage och bokstavskonst. And Pettersson was an artist who, despite being very active during the 60s, never became a part of history of the experimental 60s. Maybe because of his ceaseless and always playful and punning work between genres, poetry, visual art, music, and graphic design. In 1963, Bernt Pettersson travels to Norway in order to look for traces of Kurt Schwitters, who stayed in Lysaker outside Oslo between 1937 and 1940. He finds nothing, but when he stops at a petrol station, he's offered a bag with the text "Bruk posen," Norwegian for "use the bag," emphasizing the letters B and P as in British Petroleum, but above all as in his own name, Bernt Pettersson. And he takes this invitation to use the bag seriously, and this is the start of a new several-year-long process of ceaseless punning on bags, the most important result of which is the book object "I påsen," in the bag that you see on the left side of the slide. I påsen is a block of visually designed typewritten text in different colors and put in a paper bag, published in 1965 as a book by Bok Haverfors förlag, and also an exhibition. The 27 White, blue, orange, yellow, or black pages are bound together in the upper edge, but perforated so that you can always choose to tear them out and rearrange them on the wall. Graphically, the pages play with the form of the bag, empty or most frequently filled with letter, words, phrases, numbers, coherent or fragmented, dispersed. The material in the composition is biographically coded, but it's incessantly subjected to different formal manipulations, homophonic and semantic punning, references to Dada, Switters, Joyce, Cage, and many others. So the last example is a Swedish conceptual artist, publisher, and archivist, and maker of artist books, Leif Eriksson, and we are at the moment working on a book on his publishing activities. In 1978, Leif Eriksson creates the publishing house Wedge Press and Cheese, devoted to artist books and a space for other unusual books and seemingly useless printed matter, as he formulates it. He also founded the archive SAB, Swedish Archive of Artist Books. So already from the beginning, he acknowledged that there was not only important to create a structure for the production of artist books, of equal importance for this kind of practice was the archive, the structure that would both see to the preservation and make the publications readable in new ways by putting them into relation to other practices and bookworks. And in the summer of 1978, Leif Eriksson got an invitation to the art project The Disposable University to give a lecture on earlier works that had ended him up in court, but he was tired of that process and instead decided to publish the book The Waste Paper Act and also to defend it as a thesis. And this occasion marks the beginning of a new phase in Eriksson's artistic practice, what he calls the publishing structure as a work of art. So what kind of book is The Waste Paper Act? The half-title page reads, "This paper is published by Leif Eriksson and dedicated to the Institute of Art, the Disposable University, 1978, Balderup, Sweden." And then follows a list with artworks beginning with a rewritten December issue of Playboy, 1975. Techniques and materials are meticulously described, and a note states that the object is made without written permission of Playboy. So questions on copyright and appropriation is also present in work number 2, entitled Artistic Theft and Intellectual Receiving, and the list in all contains 20 works. Some existing, others instructions for work to be made, while yet others are instructions for works that are impossible to realize. So in other words, the Waste Paper Act is a text-based work that also considers the structures it is a part of, the publishing structure that it initiates, the form of the academic dissertation, and the description and the classification of the archive. And many of the components that would continue to be important to Leif Eriksson's activities are present here. Self-documentation as an integrated in part of the artistic practice, inventories, lists, cataloging, etc. The Waste Paper Act also initiated a dialogue with another system for creating value, art history in the academic world. He defended his thesis at the Disposable University between 5:15 and 6:30 p.m. the 11th of July in 1978 to the 3 opponents that you see here, Lars Vilks, Thomas Mathisen, and Tate Mathisen. So to me it's interesting to see how closely interlaced the spaces of production need to be with the spaces of preservation and reception for experimental and not easily defined projects. And I think that this is one of the reasons why artistic practices such as Leif Eriksson can continue to be sources of energy today is precisely because they make infrastructures visible and they recognize them as fields charged with ideology, economics, politics, and chance. And here you find a mix of intellectual curiosity, artistic experimentation, and a work across and between genres and technologies, inventions of structures, and a critical practice by means of creating other spaces. Ontology, whatever else it is usually just forgotten infrastructure, writes media theorist John Peters. And if the question of infrastructure seems to be one of the most urgent and aesthetically productive today, this is because infrastructure conditions our possibility to interact in the world and to create new spaces for other thoughts, spaces for possible or impossible projects, and other ways of reading, looking, and thinking.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And we'll open up for questions after we've heard all the four panelists, as you have understood. So we'll move right on to you, Joasia Krysa. You're based in Liverpool now, but you were previously from 2012 to 2014 at Aarhus Kunsthal in Denmark. And there you did this project that we'll now learn about. But I'll also mention that you're still associate professor at the university there in curating. But right now you are Director of Exhibition Research Centre at Liverpool John Moores University and Head of Research at Liverpool Biennial, which I think means for ordinary people that you're part of the curatorial team for the Biennial, which opens in a few weeks.
That's right.
But you're not allowed to talk about that today?
Yes, I'm not allowed at all, well, not a single word.
Let's at least start with Aarhus.
Okay, let's start with Aarhus. Thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks to Jonas and Tate. Jonas has asked me to talk about the project exhibition entitled, here is a long title, Aarhus Rapport, Avant-garde as Network, or the Politics of the Ultra-Local. The exhibition was held at Kunsthal Aarhus in 2014 during my tenure as artistic director, and it was co-curated with the Danish art historian and curator Lars Bang-Larsen, and developed with a large group of people, large network of Danish research institutions, artists, curators, writers, publishers, archivists, and so on, over a long period of time, to conclude a 2-year series, larger artistic program entitled Systemic Series. I won't talk about the larger program, I just will talk about this particular exhibition. And I will only talk about the exhibition, I will not concentrate on specific artists or projects, as there were a lot of them, so we simply don't have time. But I'll try to map a basic framework for how the exhibition emerged and why it was important to do it at the time. So the complex title of the exhibition, well, first of all, it followed the formula from previous exhibitions, and all previous exhibitions in this program had very long, very complicated titles, purposefully. This one in particular was very complicated, as it made reference to various different ideas and concepts, or things. So first of all, it made reference to Aarhus Rapport, 1961-69, a book that documented experimental art in and around the city of Aarhus, as Jonas said, the second biggest city in Denmark, and that was in the 60s, and the notion of the ultra-local, to identify some threads of contemporary practices and continuities between local and the global. And I will go back, I will return to this a little bit later. For the last decade or so, avant-garde tactics and events have been conceptually, theoretically, and historically reinvestigated and reenacted as part of network geographies and histories. This exhibition was, first of all, a way to reflect upon influence of historical avant-garde on the practices today, but also to ask a question whether it is possible at all to locate the avant-garde in space and time now. If it takes a shape, for me personally, it is neither forward nor backward looking, but more transversal, indeed more networked. The exhibition started with a single discovery of this little book, a slide behind me, entitled Aarhus Rapports, 1961-1969. And I found this book in the basement of Kunsthal Aarhus, the institution that I ran as artistic director, in the summer of 2012, when I was first thinking of putting together a larger artistic program. So preparing, looking through archives and looking at material to investigate, first of all, a history of institution. It was the institution will celebrate its 100 years anniversary in 2017 yet it was very little, the institution was very little known, or still is very little known, outside of Denmark. So I was trying to look at the history and see how it shaped its place today. And here I thank Lars Bang Larsen, I'm returning back to the little book. I thank Lars Bang Larsen for drawing my attention to this little book, for pointing that it actually exists and I should look for it, and subsequently for agreeing to work with me on this project and develop exhibition and other outputs from this longer process. The book was published in 1969 by Aarhus Art Society of 1847, the art society that actually established the institution, which is called today Kunsthal Aarhus. And the book documented an important but largely neglected story in the history of Danish contemporary art, providing evidence of extraordinary and international activity at a time during which Aarhus was arguably the central focus for more radical and political contemporary art in Denmark than, for example, Copenhagen, capital of Denmark. The book, I just flip through some slides from the book, original book. The book became it was fascinating for me. It was a book in Danish. I do not speak Danish, so obviously my first contact with this book was through names of artists and places that I could recognize from being in Aarhus, and on a more visual level. And then the book got translated, and then we started working with the material. In the way we worked is that the temporal concept of the avant-garde was used to make quite paradoxical connections between radical historical work at the time, perceived to be ahead of its time, and contemporary work that looks through the future, that looks at the future through historization and the confusion of avant, post, avant, and beyond. So if the concept of avant-garde has become somewhat discredited today, and the integration of art and life fully realized, as some would argue, for example, Franco Berardi would say that, would suggest that, and thinking of the more distorted form of subsumption of avant-garde into creative industries, then the project asked, what can we learn from the history now? In his essay commissioned as a companion to the exhibition, entitled The Avant-Garde and the Ultra-Local Tectonics, Systems and Shape, Lars Bang Larsen poses the question, where is the avant-garde today? And then he responds to this question, I quote, nobody has the avant-garde, it is nowhere in particular to be found, and it is always late. And I think it's a really good quote. So here you see some examples from the pages of the book, which was this catalog documenting 8 years of activities that happened in Aarhus around. They were predominantly self-organized activities in the what we could call locale. Hence, you can see it as a manifestation of the active writing of the art history from a decentered position. The book was reporting not only from Aarhus, but also from region, from places like Bedre, Oder, or Silkeborg, about people, actors who were nationally, internationally renowned, and who are still renowned, and others whom are more marginal in the history. And just to return to the ultra-local, again I thank Lars Bang Larsen for introducing that term after Salvador Dali, who in turn attributed this term to Michel de Montaigne, and the formula from which it derives says, I won't go into French, but I translate into English, only from the ultra-local one can arrive at the universal. So the politics of the ultra-local in the title of the exhibition refers to a time when contemporary art or the avant-garde was networked in a very different way than it is through digital networks today, where space and time are further compressed under the influence of globalization, internet, and digital technologies. in relation to the use of the term network in the exhibition title, Jonas has already mentioned Dutch data scholar Hubert van den Berg, who already in 2005 introduced the idea of thinking of avant-garde as a network or as a rhizomatic structure. And then the whole work of Danish art historian and scholar Tanja Orum, for example, who argues that in Nordic context, it is actually only when you recognize the transnational networks that you discover the avant-garde. And she speaks of the historical avant-garde and points to the many self-organized network activities that to demonstrate that avant-garde art is not something that just happens in Berlin and Paris and then spreads to marginal areas, but that it is rather like a network, something much more dynamic. So going back to the exhibition, this is how we worked with this little book. So it was historical exhibition, but it was actually more than that. Participants of the project, the whole group of people, I won't list them all here, but including a group of contemporary Danish and international artists, were invited to investigate, make selections, reinterpret the original material, and respond to the original book, to the original content of the book, and to its spirit of unruly experimentation. The book appeared in the exhibition as an archive, but also as a pretext or a script containing certain suggestions and investigations of methods, motives, formal vocabularies, social energies, historical narratives. In the spirit of the exhibition, which was a really large-scale exhibition in quite a small space of 1,000 square meters with over 20 artists, the book appeared, so in the spirit of the book, the exhibition included historical documentation, and this is a small section, archive section, that gathered documentation, but also some original artworks. It also included reenactments of artworks, and Lars Bang-Larsen has a dedicated room in where he ran, within the 3-month period of the exhibition, Lars has run his several exhibitions within exhibitions in his room, so that was an extremely complicated structure of the project. And you can see some examples of reenacted works. And then it also included newly commissioned works. And this is also a reenacted work by Henrik Andersson in the garden. Another reenacted work. And a new work commissioned from Lea Porsager. And other new commissions included artists Jacob Jacobsen, Showbic X, UK Museum of Asger, and US-based artist David Halfish Bailey. Are we doing on time? Still time? Loads of time.
3 minutes.
Great, okay. David Halfish Bailey, so that's my last slide, just to leave you with this. So the key issues that emerged from this project, and as I said, the project was developed over a period of over a year with several people who had very different interests in this material. So for example, Lars's interest was in examining the notion of avant-garde through the methodology of reenactments, so hence his program of reenactments. Mine was much more to do with organizational structures and curatorial methodologies and processes. Other people investigated idea of avant-garde as something that doesn't exist in art anymore, but it exists in digital commons or commons in general and peer-to-peer networks. Some people were interested in archival material and representing this material. Some other people were interested in anti-reenactments. Don't ask me what it is, anti-reenactments. So enactments and then anti-reenactment. But the key issues that emerged from this project And it was a very unruly project. So the way it developed was we had initial meetings with several people, and then everyone took on a different role and different interests and developed this. And then these people would invite more people, and then these people would invite more people. Until the day of the opening of the exhibition, we didn't have a list of artists or artworks closed. So that was very organic and very unorganized way of curating exhibition, which actually curated itself in the end. To the point that on the day of the closing of the exhibition, we had a new set of artists arriving and performing and reenacting original performances, including original actors being invited to perform. So that was a very unruly project, I would say. But the key issues that emerged was relationship between history and historical material and contemporary conditions. So work represented in the contemporary context were original, presented again, or some reenacted and some new commissions and reinterpreted or commenting on the original. Also, how archival materials can be activated, reminiscent of media archaeology approach, for example. And I draw here on the approach by Wolfgang Ernst, who argues that objects have an ability to tell their own stories. So reenactment is a description of how objects in archive can become operative and produce alternative epistemologies. And what also emerged is this idea of methodology, method, both in relation to curatorial and artistic processes and structures. So again, reenactment is particularly significant here as a way of translating and interpreting original material into here and now. And then collective processes, self-organization and network approach, which sort of emerged through our working process on the project, which again borrowed from the book. And I could go back to a few slides ago. And here you see this example in the book. There is a sort of page where invites people to bring their projects, calls for action, calls for exhibition, calls for self-organized way of participating. Aleph Presser described the exhibition, who wrote a couple of articles, one including following this exhibition. In Kunstkritik, in one of his articles, he described the exhibition as that exhibition was about avant-garde networking rather than simply the avant-garde as network. Here something was actively, and I quote from him, he says, here something was actively worked, reworked, and networked. And he ends his article asking, how can the current theorizing of networks be mobilized in order to reinvigorate the notion of the historical avant-garde as a network? But my question would be different. I personally wouldn't make a claim for the usefulness of the term avant-garde today. I don't think it has, but more to understand better how networks across time and space offer insights into the way the various relations, historical, temporal, material, geographical, and aesthetic, are configured and might be reconfigured, and how self-organization has been explored as creative and political force. And again, I give example, one of the projects in the exhibition by UK-based Museum of Asger investigated this. So they organized the screening of selected avant-garde films that they had in that collection, online collection, and that was made available through peer-to-peer networks.
Time is more or less up.
I actually have finished.
That was your...
On my question, yes. Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Joasia. Very interesting, and we will end with Eline Mugaas, Norwegian artist working primarily in photography, video, and collage, editing and publishing the magazine Album. I would call it a photography fanzine, would you? More or less?
picture.
Picture, yes.
Image fanzine.
Image-based fanzine, yes.
Yeah.
And with the Norwegian artist Elise Storsveen. And together these two artists in 2013 co-curated the exhibition Hold steinhardt fast på greia di, Norwegian Art and Women's Rights 1968 to 1989. And no one has managed to translate it yet, but it means something like hold on to your thing. And this exhibition clearly illustrated the lack of work being done in this area in major Norwegian institutions. And starting from there, I think it's correct to say, you delve deeper into the work of Siri Aurdal, which is an artist that you're now working both with in terms of her visibility, but also collaborating with.
Yes.
Please, Elina, the floor is yours.
In 2012, I came across a small black and white image of a large curving structure with a man sitting inside of it. And this image made me kind of stop in my tracks because it was from a space, an exhibition space in Oslo, which was basically the biggest and most important exhibition space of contemporary art in Oslo until 1990. And it was the work was done by an artist, Siri Aurdal, a woman. I had never heard about the piece, and I had never heard about Siri Aurdal. And thinking of myself as slightly more than average interested in artists of this generation and of female artists of this generation in particular, this was kind of shocking. And out from this image started this investigation. I was at this time doing research for the show that Jonas was mentioning, Hold steinhardt fast på greia di, Women Rights and Art in Norway from 1968 to 1989. That show started out as a kind of, we thought it was going to be a light sort of pulling together of furious, fun material related to March 8 rallies and things that Elisa, my colleague, and I remembered from my childhood, but we didn't see anywhere being represented. Starting to work very closely with Kunsthall Oslo, we soon came to realize that no institution in Norway had done a historical survey on feminism and art in Norway. So that made our work sort of clearly cut out for us. It was needed to be done, so we just had to go get on with it. So that show opened on March 8 in 2013, which was the Norwegian centennial for the women's right to vote. There were about 80 works in that show from around 20 artists, some collaborative pieces. And although some of the artists were well known, there were several artists in there that I think for the younger generations of you have never heard about. And some of them, there was, for example, Sissel Påske, who was an artist who really worked with the notion of quality as a sort of starting point for a critique towards a very male-dominated art world. And she's now going to have her first show at the Art Museum in Oslo in the fall. Posthumously, she died in 1980. Another artist was Wenche Mühleisen, who spent the late 1970s and early 80s living with the Vienna Actionists alongside Otto Mühl and Valley Export. And she did performances with Documenta in 82, but this show ended up being the first time that she was actually presented in an art context in Norway. And then we had Siri Aurdal, who worked in large modular sculptures. And this is the full picture from the installation at Kunstnernes Hus in '69, which I saw a small image of, and that sort of piqued my interest. At first glance, Siri Aurdal's work is, she works with formal concerns, and you could sort of quickly identify her as a late modernist. But there are certain things that makes her work differentiate from a lot of other artists in Norway that worked with large abstract sculpture in the 60s. Siri's work is really work that is, she consciously have moved the work down from the pedestal, down from a sort of hierarchical position, and she opens the work up as a social space, and it's that social space that she's been interested in. She had been working with industrial material like plastics and plexiglass and fiberglass and these, to find material that can both that was both cheap to work with or relatively cheap, but also that could handle people playing and working, hanging out within it. So this work is actually the work that we ended up remaking for the feminist show that she originally had done for Artist Space in 1968 in Oslo, and later had been hung in a school, had disappeared over time. And yeah, we found the same material, we found the same colors, and with the help of some slides, we were able to redo it. After this show came down, Siri needed to move from the apartment that she had lived and worked for 40 years or so. And also, what had happened a bit was that in 1980, she'd had, because of health issues, she had pulled out of the art world, dropped out, and had sort of lived more and more secluded. And this, of course, is a big reason that I had never heard about it, as I was just 10 years old in 1980. But realizing that she needed this move and she needed help to do that, I took it upon myself to help her organize the packing down, but also very much because I was interested to see if there was anything left that we could sort of put together as an archive, and that can somehow give information about the work that she had done. It could somehow say something about the very few images that was left. Because what I then also knew was that none of her large sculptural works existed anymore. So through then several months through that fall, we were going through this apartment that she lived and worked in, and sort of picking apart all these rooms of things. And mostly what we came up with were small pieces of paper, notes, drafts, all kinds of little ephemera that belonged to a whole life of an artist. And more I was concerned with this, like what happens to this type of archives. Working with a lot of the other artists from the feminist show, it was evident that a lot of artists were sitting on large archives of work or material that related to the work that had no place to go. And also, in instances where the artists were no longer alive, they were usually their sons or nephews or daughters that sat on boxes and boxes of material that it was difficult for them to know where it belonged. And I was concerned with this actually being part of our sort of cultural heritage, and that nobody seemed to be interested in what happened to that material. And how many sort of generations of daughters and nephews it actually takes for this to disappear completely. So what I was starting to ask myself was, how do you actually talk about a body of work when the work no longer has a body? How can you actually talk about that? How can you sort of make an argument for the whole extended work of a life of an artist when there's nothing really physical to show for, when what she worked with was physical objects? And so I ended up moving a lot of the material from her studio to my studio to sort of go through it and see if I could find some type of structures through that, like what will fit together, and how this could actually be translated and explained to other people outside of her and me. And out of that came the idea of making a book. So this is the book right here. You can look at it afterwards. The book, of course, being a sort of favored space in terms of this alternative to making an exhibition, or also the fact that it can somehow hold the type of material in a different way, the way that it's so condensed, but it also, what was really important about it was the possibility for there to be something that could also be found at a later moment, that years down the line when an art student or an art historian and another artist looking for something from this time, that it wasn't just one exhibition that was up for a month or 6 weeks and then sort of disappear down again into this sort of ocean of hopeful artists or dead artists, but that there was something that somehow had put it into some kind of order, and where actually maybe some writing could be done as well. But there was another thing about the book too that was important, and that was that the material from CD lent itself so well to the format of a book. And I've been interested also in this, like how, because so much of her material was now in smaller pieces of paper, you could actually, by scanning them, have a sense in the book that you were holding the same material that I have been holding, shifting through her studio. Because also what have happened at the time after CD had pulled out of the art world was that, as I realized this as I was going through a lot of her stuff, was that she kind of hadn't stopped working. She had just pulled out of a public, and she was no longer in a dialogue with the public world. But she had a Xerox machine in her apartment, and everything, all her material had been many times through this Xerox machine. So first, an image had been Xeroxed, an image of the sculpture had been Xeroxed, and then that Xerox had been Xeroxed again. And then there had been drawings done to that Xerox. And this also was interesting, I thought, what is these different periods of an artist's life of how you work, and how do you continue work after you have stopped working? So another thing that was interesting to me, like putting this together, the book, is also how to try to follow a train of thought through just visual material. Is there a way that I could somehow convey some kind of thread through this material without writing? Because that was also important to me, that I don't really write. And what was the kind of thing that I could sort of bring to the table that an art historian wouldn't bring to the table, that would be different, but that would somehow make some kind of groundwork that somebody else could take somewhere later. Let's see if I have some pictures. This is one of the CD sculptures that she did for the municipality of Oslo for a children's school that was done in 1972. And that has sort of become important in her story, because this was for her a dream assignment. There was a piece of work that was going to the type of audience that she was interested to work for. She was very concerned with children as an audience and the people outside the art institutions. So this was, in her mind, a very sort of complete work. This sculpture stood in the schoolyard for 24 years before it was taken down. But by that time, she was not really involved anymore and did not respond to letters and phone calls from the municipality. And when she didn't respond, and this work was then needed to be restored, it was kind of treated as just used playground material, and actually in the end discarded. I think it was, discarded in 2008. Let's go to the pictures then. Yeah. Here's an image of Siri today with one of her prints from the 1970s. And this is also, of course, since I have worked with photography for a long time, this was also a way of for the book to become this meeting point between her work and my point, in a place that we could sort of work out this dialogue that happened. An image from the book. One of my images of one of her small models, because she worked in these scale models, making her sculptures. And this is from, we opened the show now in March. It just came down last weekend in Oslo, in the same space that she showed in 1969. We were able to redo that big sculptural installation that you see here. And it was up again and had a body again, which I thought was really important. Some people suggested that we could just make a seminar and show people the pictures. But I really do believe that a sculpture is an experience in the now, in physical experience. So it was really wonderful to see it back up. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to very soon open up to the floor. But I was thinking, as you prepare your questions, I could ask one to each of the four of you. And it's all going to be questions, I think all questions are going to be about politics. Because Siri, and I will start with you, Siri was a communist.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking about the communism, democratic materials, new materials, not exactly space age, but fiberglass, and the ideas of the democratic sculpture of the 70s. So how did you reflect on that together with her during this project?
No, this is something we talked a lot about this, and it is interesting because it's also part of I think, the conflict. I think I find these ideas very interesting, and I'm interested in them. I'm drawn to the sculpture because of that. But I also see that somehow this has also been part of why she's not included in the institution today. And I find that my work today is very much about trying to get her back into that setting that she was actually trying to work outside. Because somehow the art institution is the place that holds onto that history. When you're no longer there to carry your sculpture around, somebody else has to do that work. And
because that one piece of sculpture in the schoolyard was crazy dangerous. You would never have been allowed with today's regulations and standards. But to her,
you could give all the children helmets and they will be fine.
But to her, it was perhaps a realization of a democratic ideal, of play and of.
I don't think. I think it's by today's standards, there's certain things that would be crazy dangerous, like the fact that there was concrete underneath, things like that. You would change it, but to a large extent, you could still have that in a schoolyard, I think.
And Henrik, I was thinking about Asger Jorn. I mean, with the situationist, that's also a radical politics. That's a political criticism of capitalism. How does that feed into his, it's not romantic, but his research, let's say, into what you call almost a Nordic classical age of the Middle Ages? So what's left of radical politics in his interest in these stones in Gotland?
I've been thinking a lot about that, actually, and I think also in relating to the title of this, looking back, thinking forward, it seemed to be a Scandinavian way of thinking. No, but the sort of development of the welfare state was very much an effort to connect backwards or connect, and it was a way to create a narrative to implement this industrial nation-state capital with a social face. So I think his historical interest in the Nordic avant-garde needs to be seen in that way, that it is a movement forwards and backwards. But I tend to use it, I mean, to as a tool, basically. I mean, I both sort of could admire these people, but I also hate the idea of the avant-garde. I mean, it's terrible. But I come across it when I teach sometimes, and the art students, and I realize that when I sort of introduce concepts, or it seems like I talk to them as art history starts in New York in 1960, and this is a problem. It's a very big problem, and for me, this looking at this material was kind of a remedy to that.
Mm. And I was going to ask you that also, Joasia, because in Denmark there was this female artist reenacting performances by Yves Klein. And I'm not targeting her, just an example of how many Nordic artists has been working with history and with the history of the avant-garde. Picking these stars, now this is a French artist, but feeding into the US-centric history of avant-garde art. And I was thinking about this idea of the ultra-local, or just a local, let's say, as a starting point. How did these Danish artists experience this? Was this something new to them, or was this something already well-known, and was it productive?
Sorry, are you asking me about the
Aarhus,
artists in particular in the Aarhus report today, that we worked with today?
Yeah, to say that Danish artists can actually, they don't need to start with major international names if they're going to do their historical investigation. They can start with something which is very, very local. I don't know if that's productive at all. When you yourself, you work as an international curator, but in this instance, you were catapulted into a really, really local, particular situation. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. You mentioned again the ultra-local, and we had this discussion before. Originally, the title of this exhibition was to be Aarhus Report, Avant-garde's Network over Politics of the Provincial or Province. And then we thought about it, because obviously it sets out immediately the sort of opposition between periphery and center, and the discussions have been, I think, by now pretty much exhausted. And then, obviously, the ultra-local, the way I understand it and the way I take it from Lars, who took it from Salvador Dali, who took it from someone else, is this idea of, sort of shifting discussions into a more neutral way of understanding geographical and historical and contemporary relations. But you asked me about, the experience of artists. I mean, it was an interesting process, because, as you said, I came to Kunsthal Aarhus completely from somewhere else, completely not knowing history or understanding history. And actually, I wasn't even particularly interested in history. What I wanted to do with the institution is that I was fascinated by the history, thinking, okay, the institution is 100 years old, but it's not very well known. But it has produced this amazing stuff over this time. So how come today, first, no one knows about it, and no one knows about the institution? And then we unraveled the whole sort of network of people around it, and a lot of them, from that time, obviously still alive and producing work, like Henrik Andersson, based in Copenhagen, producing work constantly. And then we started digging into archives and looking at what's left of it today. And I think a lot of artists, the artists work in different ways, I've already mentioned. Antti Pyrine, publishers, Matthias Kokholm, they simply, as a starting point, reproduce the original book. There was only, when I looked first in the cellar, in the archive of the institution, there was only 6 copies left, so they're very precious of this little book. And then Matthias reproduced in hundreds of the books, which we now give away. And then I think there was, again, you're talking about politics, there was a lot, in terms of politics, there was a lot discussion about who is included, who is not included in this historical reconstruction. Well, not really historical reconstruction, but this historical reflection. And again, you see how this format at the time, so the book documented activities between 61 and 69, which is 8 years of activities in various, large locations. So those politics, again, became quite reenacted, the idea of who is included, who is not, who is still alive, who has rights to material and who is not. And in the end, as I said, we just just let it go. So whoever wanted to participate somehow finds its way into this project and participated. And the list of names was very long. I can't even remember how many artists we had. I mean, a lot.
But I will pick up on that then when I ask you, Cecilia, because in OEI, I mean, your publications are there are many pages in them, and you know, they're very authoritative in that sense. On the other hand, they do not seem to be they do not seem to carry this impulse of a master narrative or the desire to create a master narrative, which is what we, I mean, when we're experiencing the avant-garde of Europe and the US, it's always filtered through this master narrative, which makes it easy for us, let's face it. Today you've heard 4 stories about, and I'm sure if you don't know these artists and these places from before, it's all very fragmented. The interesting thing about OAE is that so much research and work goes into keeping it fragmented. This is my interpretation now, trying to provoke you a little bit. But it's also very interesting, this idea about keeping the network visible rather than focusing in on heroes and masters and these master narratives. Is it, yeah.
Yeah, the question on volume or page number is, I think that's very much a result of a specific way of working. That is a montage that needs a certain kind of material in order to create this kind of more open, stratified, multi-temporal reading device, so to say. So of course it's not a project that wants to kind of lay the material to rest. In a way, it's much more multi-layered to keep a lot of different ways of reading what is in the magazine at the same time. So it's more like a transversal way of navigating through the material. But nevertheless, of course, there are points of gravitations that consist on some kind of more, you know, statement or discursive proposition on how you can relate the material to each other.
Not without politics, then. Okay, so we need to open up to the floor. Emily here has a microphone, and
I'll start then. I'll speak from the periphery of the Nordic region, from Finland, which again I think is kind of interesting to reflect how actually these sort of political artistic moments, you know, in recent history have been actually quite different, you know, in different parts of this region as well. We often think about as quite a homogeneous kind of that area. My question is kind of connects to today and this idea of thinking forward, sort of following from Jonas's focus on the politics and the Nordic welfare state. That's something that we see as something that we share. And I think we do, the different countries in the Nordic region. We also share the moment of kind of the last remaining bits of the Nordic welfare state that are still left, that at least in Finland our government is very busy on trying to get rid of as soon as possible. And so I'm kind of interested in that, you know, aspect of how do you, how can we think forward, you know, looking back, you know, looking at this moment that was very politicized, at least in Finland, extremely politicized in the 60s and 70s. It was very, you know, and also there's a kind of a trauma in Finland in the art world that still kind of hangs on there. It's still very difficult to engage with that moment. And so I'm kind of curious because I think all the countries have had slightly different moments then. The Nordic welfare state is now being also looked at critically, you know, the recent histories in relation to nationalism, which is something that, you know, brought to mind this idea of focus on the history, a focus on the kind of, the sort of national romantic building of the kind of identity of the Nordic, that is also connected to that. The other side is, of course, the kind of very radical socialist, you know, communist, for example, in the case of this one artist from Norway. So what is your opinion? What can we sort of learn from this moment, looking back at now and trying to understand what's going on now maybe, but also thinking forward from this moment? Because there's no going back, you know, politically, I think, in the region anymore.
I don't know who wants to. I mean, one way of starting connecting to that question and to Finland would be, Joseph, if you could, because you did a lot of work on Erkki Kuriniemi, working out of that political situation.
I seem to be.
No, but I thought that was interesting because he came out of that political situation in Finland in the 60s.
But I don't think it answers your question, really, the project that I did.
I
know you tried.
Anyone feel that they could
Save the Nordic model.
no, is that what you asked for? Saving the Nordic model?
Well, if you are, kind of a miracle,
Oh, how to end it gracefully, perhaps. I don't know.
I think it's difficult, but I mean, of course, one way of looking forward would be to criticize it also, not to look back at it as because it was, I guess, founded on I mean, at least in Sweden, in a very, what should we say, ethnically clean environment. This is we need to remember that, and this is no, I mean, so, and I think we Nordic countries now needs to shape up and deal with that.
Wait a second. Hold on a second. Thank you.
Are Laplanders included in this Nordic culture?
More and more so.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit
about Laplanders?
Well, in terms of, it's just you keep referring to the periphery and the center and inclusion, exclusion, things like that. So I just wondered where the Laplanders would be in that whole. And you had concerns about the past and the present and all of that. So if we are to think of the tomorrow, then I think we need to bring in the Laplanders as well.
Of course. There's a growing debate about the Sami community. And but to connect backwards to this is that, as I talked before, that the ethnically clean Scandinavia is, I mean, it's if you go back like 100 years ago, it's actually constructed in a colonial idea of the Inuit in the north and the Sami, and then you would have the southern sort of Mediterranean and the North European, and I think it's almost a Norwegian explorer. I think it's Amundsen. He says in a lecture saying that the Nordic countries are specifically suitable racially to colonize the North. So this idea, Scandinavia is constructed around this idea, and people have suffered from that. Sami community is one.
Well, it's interesting to note that there was a desire among Nordic artists since the mid-19th century to create a Nordic art institution, and it was created in the end in 1978. It lasted for almost 20 years. Almost 30 years. But the last exhibition before it was closed down, and it was decided that you don't need to focus on this Nordic situation anymore, was an exhibition called Rethinking Nordic Colonialism. So it was, this was the instance when Nordic social democracy caught up with itself and said that we're going to focus our efforts internationally. That's where the markets are. That was the reasoning. And the idea of doing work on the Nordic level was left to the side. But the final exhibition was made by two Danish curators, and it's called Rethinking Nordic Colonialism. Unfortunately, then that has not been done on the same scale since then, 2006. but and I would say in a Norwegian context, it's getting increasingly important. But in my view, perhaps the Nordic countries has been so concerned with their own peripheral status towards Paris, London, and New York, so that perhaps we haven't been aware enough of our own peripheries. There are several layers of peripheries within the Nordic region, as was noted here.
As a few of you mentioned before about networks in the avant-garde art groupings, so to speak, but also fragmented in the Nordic countries, but also networking between each other. Can you see that mirrored in today's art world? Is there a similar movement happening that years from now will be seen as being something that right now is maybe not being quite as recognized, or maybe the opposite way around? Can you see, in a sense, the same network being mirrored in today's art world? Do you feel like you're a part of what will be kind of seen, as you're talking now of them, will you feel like you are a part of something now that will, I leave it down to you.
Anyone want to have a go? Contemporary Nordic avant-garde networks. Do they exist? Or are we all just historicizing?
I can't really speak for the... Is it on? Oh, actually, I have this one, sorry. I can't really speak for the whole Nordic region. I do apologize completely, I can't. But the question of, so taking it a little bit away from Nordic region, your question about networks, I mean, as I was trying to sort of make the point in my presentation, is that we talk about networks in the way avant-garde then was organized, and it was through networks, but in a very different way than today networks operate. I mean, if we look at digital networks, socio-technological networks, it's a very, it's an invisible structure that is there present, and people operate in this way. And there's, again, I repeat my argument, if anyone looks for any reminiscence of avant-garde practices, this is what you can find in open source communities, peer-to-peer networks, and digital commons. That's one way of pointing to contemporary networks. But then you can look at how contemporary art develops through, it's so network in a sort of profound, in a very, what's the word? In a very sort of visible way. I mean, look at, for example, and I said I will not speak about Liverpool Biennial, but I talk about biennials. Biennials are this sort of network of contemporary art world that operate in a very particular way and circulate particular curators, artists, concepts, and works around the world. So it's much more global today. But again, I can't speak about Nordic region in particular.
Good question, but it seems like we're in a historicizing mode today. So.
Maybe continuing on from that, or maybe departing from it slightly. I bring you best wishes from the Immateriality Conference, which is happening just across town at Chelsea College of Arts. So we spent the morning talking about tactility and sort of looking at archives, the creation of them, the preservation of them, the usage of them, and touch. That was a central motif. And it occurs to me that it seems like the hard copy book is really central to what all of you were speaking about. And I guess something that I'm really fascinated by is how the hard copy book will go forward and be used by future generations. And simultaneously how the internet is changing our interaction with hard copies. And I'm just wondering if you could offer a few reflections on maybe, and Cecilia, this might be a good question for you to come in on, because it's my sense that, for instance, I don't know how you might be able to differently articulate the book as a space of exhibition and the book as an exhibition catalog. And I guess I'd be interested to know if there are prompts for reading the text differently in the text itself, and what those look like, and if others have thoughts about how their particular hard copies might be resourced as archives, as networks, or as other constellations of thinking and materiality? It would be good to hear.
Cecilia?
Thank you. Just to make a short detour first, when we're talking about this periphery and networks, and I would just also like to focus on the mail art scene that, for instance, Leif Eriksson was very active in, which also, I mean, from a very, very local position, he also kind of, were part on a very, very specific, in one way, localized artistic community that was extreme. I mean, that were spanning all over the country, and so that's also like another aspect of how those very specific avant-garde or experimental practices also found their own ways of communicating through with each other. But in terms of the difference between thinking a publication as an exhibition versus a catalog, I would say that it is. I mean, in one way, of course, it's a way of how do you deal with the image material, how do you edit it, and how do you present it in what kind of agency do you want this material to have in a way, and I think that's a little bit different if you do a catalog, when you think of more you kind of represent artworks or different artworks. But in terms of I don't know really how to kind of formulate that difference because it's so founded in the actual material that you work with, that also allows for a specific kind of editing the material. But of course, it's another way of reading the material that you are looking for when you work with this kind of larger montage structures that also doesn't really need to relate to the texts in a direct way. So you can have different reading tracks, you can kind of allow for different spaces in the publications where you can enter from a visual logic, and you can kind of walk around it, you can move around it, and you can relate to different visual themes, for example. And I would say that is a different way of working than if you do a catalog. I never made a catalog, so I wouldn't actually know, but that's what I would presume. But maybe you can also say something about the visual work that you did with
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this thing about between the catalog and a different type of visual book. And one of the things that became clear when I started talking to Siri Aurdal about making a book was that she and I had very different idea about what that book should be. So we needed to have a really sort of long conversation about who was doing the work or what kind of book it was going to be, because I wasn't interested in making a catalog. And it needed to, because I also find that is the place where the book opens up for me as an interesting space, is that place where there is, as you said, different entry points, and where there's other ways of connecting to the material. And I was also interested in working with the pieces of paper in the book as material too, as Siri was working on other pieces of paper. So it was interesting how you flip a page from one, and that relates to the actual paper that was scanned. So at places you scan the piece of paper on both sides and have it printed on both sides on that other paper to sort of talk about, how can you talk about what you're actually showing? Like when do you see actually something in a one-to-one relationship to what it was originally? In terms of touch is important, right? And what do you need to do to actually, there's all this information, even in a piece of paper, there's all this information that just, like a photograph or a scan of that piece of paper can be really great or really shitty, depending on if you understand what type of information you want to be transferred to the viewer. And so all these are the things that I'm interested in about the book, about how again, that you can let the viewer somehow discover the connection between the two things without overly stating how they belong together, but there can also be room for the possibility that they don't really belong together, but that there is some kind of possible connection anyway. And I guess in relation to the internet, I guess that also makes you more aware of the book, this possibility in the book, in the hard copy book, that there's other ways of, excellent ways of sharing information through the internet, through other types of technology, and that sort of makes you more aware of the qualities that the book has. So it's not so either or.
I guess we're taking one or two final questions.
I have one, but I'm aware that the mic has been very much in this side of the room, so just raise your hand if you...
It is possible to transport, you're saying that it is actually possible to transport it to the other side of the room.
But I might just ask a quick question. I've been quite interested actually, I guess thinking about Elina's work and Henrik's work about this kind of idea of quite a personal investment and journey with this kind of material, and also this aspect of, I guess, taking care. And I wondered how that might play out, or if that plays out I mean, this could go to anyone really, but in that kind of revisiting strategy, is there a kind of caretaking process that is also going on? Throwing that out.
I mean, they're totally different in the sense that Asger doesn't need more recognition. On the contrary, yeah. So in that sense, it's different. But Asger is dead and Siri is alive. So I was actually wondering, what does your relationship to each other look like? How did she react when you approached her? You're 80 years old. Yeah. Here comes this younger artist. Let's make something together.
Well, it of course, yes. It's she to answer it very specifically. When I first, Siri was one of the artists that the way that I got in contact with her, but it was through a way that I got in contact with several of the other artists in this feminist show, was actually by calling everybody in the phone book that had the same last name. And you know, then it's great to come from a small country. And for some of the other ones, then I found some family members. You know, the question was, do you have a mother? Did you have an aunt, grandmother? It's such and such name that was an artist. And Siri was actually the only one which I actually reached her, and it was her. She had a slightly different name. And her first reaction was to say no, that she wanted nothing to do with me and nothing to do with the art world, and no. But you know, and so then it was a very long process to gain trust, and we spoke over the telephone for months before she let me meet her, and then we very, very slowly built up this relationship around her work, where I spoke about her work to her, and as an artist, I kind of know that inside every artist there is like a big ego, even when it's been dormant for a long time, and somehow it was about. But also, I became really interested in because working with a lot of these women artists that somehow hadn't had the space to, or their work were forgotten, or they hadn't sort of had the careers that I wanted. There is an indignation, and there was also, you know, it's frightening. I'm a woman. I'm 50. It's like, what are you looking into the next 30 years of your art practice? And I became interested in this possibility of sort of changing the way that you look at somebody's history. And of course, there were some of the women who were dead by the time this show happened. This kind of work could have been done with their archives as well. But it was more interesting to work with Siri because she was alive and because she has had a voice in the process, and I was interested to go into dialogue with her voice and with her opinions. And we have not at all agreed on a lot of these decisions and processes that we have been through, but I think that has made the project much richer, at least for me.
Final question here.
Okay.
So, I think final, yes. Or if anyone really eager will extend the seminar. You.
I attended a Nordic jazz festival event at King's Place some years ago, and it seemed like things were really moving forward. So do you feel the limitations that you've spoken about are specifically to do with the visual arts more than with the music scene, the Nordic music scene?
I'm sure there's some forgotten musicians there too, but they didn't make it to London. Right?
I think if you look at contemporary art in the Nordic countries these days, there are not that many forgotten artists, perhaps even some overexposed ones. Do you want me to mention names? No. But perhaps the Sami artists are some of the ones that need more attention, or what do you mean?
Could you not apply the term avant-garde to music in a way that you wouldn't be wanting to with the visual arts? So it seems, I just felt like there's a kind of a stuckness when it comes to visual arts, but that might not be applicable to other kinds of arts and culture that's happening in the Nordic. Am I making sense? Or?
Yeah, maybe. I was the term avant-garde. I spoke to a lot to Jacqueline de Jong, who she edited her own magazine, Situationist Times, which is a very interesting magazine. But I had some conversation with her, or type of interview, and she kept. And then whenever I was started to ask her about sort of the intention, what was the intention of this art piece, or this is the way I would speak to my colleagues in the same area. She would just say, well, it's avant-garde. It's avant-garde. I didn't understand her, but after a while I realized that here I come with my sort of critical distance to a topic or something, and I realized that my language that I use is, I speak as if I don't have any future, and and this is the downside of not being avant-garde, I think, that you don't have any future. So perhaps music is a better, I don't know.
So is this dwelling into the avant-garde a way of imagining a future, even though you don't have one?
Yeah, I think so.
Should we end it? But I think that Elina and Henrik now had a chance to have some kind of final words. But Joasia and Cecilia, do you want to end in a certain way, or give us
I just wanted to follow up this question, really, if we have 1 minute, your question. Because I think actually I understand what you mean. When I arrived to Denmark first, and I didn't have much experience of Danish or Nordic art generally, what struck me is this, what you called stuckness of contemporary art. And this project was one way of dealing with it, to try to understand why are we at this point in time in this particular situation. And there's a lot of resistance to anything that is different than that model. It's changing fast. And I think it's also to do a lot with the discussion that you had, or we had, or you had earlier about welfare state, because welfare state allows for particular practices to develop and continue and supports them, whereas the market model, as we know it from here or somewhere, in other countries in Europe or America, doesn't allow this practice, doesn't support these practices. So there is a different dynamic in how you sustain. But I think it's changing for better or worse. I don't know if it's better, but it's definitely changing.
Cecilia, you will now get the final word.
No, but of course, I think that in parts it's also a thing of many historiography that it's very under historicized situation that also, of course, brings out the possibility to actually work with the material in new ways, and also to to connect it to you, maybe also to look at different models and think of actually look for possibilities to think in new ways or work in new ways that were actually present to, I don't know, invent a non-possible future.
And with that, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists. Thank you very much for sharing these stories about your work. And thank you to the audience. Oh, and thank you to Marianne and Tate Modern. Were you the one who was going to say this thank you? No? It was okay?
We can share it.
We can share it.
I'll just stand here. Well, thank you again to our panel. Thank you to Jonas for chairing. And thank you all for your really engaged questions. I really enjoyed them. And if you would like to join us for a glass of wine, we have a bar outside and we'd like to kind of continue the conversation. And I'd just like to say one last thank you again to the Nordic Culture Fund for supporting these events. We hope there'll be more. And also to the Nordic Council for their support in this programme too. So thank you very much. Thank you.